August 1945. The air in Okinawa was heavy with salt and silence. The guns had gone quiet, but the island still trembled with memory. Craters in the earth, torn uniforms hanging from trees, and the faint smell of smoke that refused to fade. Among the ruins of a makeshift field hospital, a group of Japanese nurses waited for capture. Their white coats were grey with dust, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They had tended to soldiers until the bandages ran out, until the groans stopped, until duty meant simply staying alive. Lieutenant Aiko Tanaka, once a proud Red Cross nurse, stood at the doorway of the shattered clinic. She had bound her hair neatly, as though dignity could still be worn like armor. "They will not spare us," she whispered to her friend Emmy, who sat clutching a medical satchel. Emmy shook her head. "They said Americans. They punish women who serve." Aiko didn't answer. She'd heard the same rumors, that surrender meant shame, that enemy soldiers had no mercy. In her hand she held the last scalpel she hadn't thrown away, not as a weapon, but as something familiar, something from the world she understood. The rumble of engines broke the stillness. American jeeps appeared at the crest of the hill, sunlight flashing off their hoods. A white flag fluttered over the collapsed tent where the nurses had waited. When the soldiers dismounted, they didn't raise their rifles. At the front walked Captain Robert Hale, a medical officer in his early 30s, with the calm eyes of a man who'd seen too much to hate anyone. He raised a hand, signaling his men to stand down. Through an interpreter he called out, "We are medics. No harm will come to you. Put down your instruments." Aiko hesitated, then stepped forward, the scalpel trembling in her fingers. Slowly she laid it on the ground. Hale nodded once. "Good, let's get you water." The words hit her like a foreign language. Water. Not orders, not insults. Water. Within an hour, the nurses were transported to an American field post near the coast. The camp was orderly, efficient, astonishingly calm. There were rows of tents marked with red crosses, tables stacked with medical supplies, and the faint hum of generators. Aiko watched in disbelief as American medics tended not just to their own wounded, but also to several Japanese prisoners lying on stretchers. No one shouted. No one struck them. Captain Hale noticed her staring. "You're a nurse," he said, not as a question. "Yes," she replied softly. "Then help me." She blinked. "Help? You?" He gestured to a row of patients. "We've got more wounded than hands. I don't care whose flag they wore. They need treatment." For a long moment, Aiko didn't move. Then something inside her, the part that remembered training, compassion, the sanctity of care, overpowered fear. She nodded. "Hi, I will." The Americans gave her gloves, gauze, and space to work. Emmy joined her, still trembling but determined. Together they cleaned wounds, changed dressings, and whispered quiet reassurances to men who could no longer tell which side they belonged to. The Japanese soldiers on the cots stared in disbelief as familiar faces leaned over them, women in white coats speaking their language but wearing calm instead of despair. One whispered, "Sister Tanaka, we lost." Aiko paused, meeting his glassy eyes. "No," she said gently. "We are alive. That is enough." Captain Hale overheard the words. Later he told his staff, "That woman just defined victory better than any general." That evening, the camp's horizon burned orange with sunset. Aiko sat outside the tent, washing her hands in a basin of cool water. The dirt swirled away, leaving the faint scars of old burns across her wrists, souvenirs from a collapsing hospital months before. Hale approached quietly. "You've done good work today." She looked up, unsure if it was praise or pity. "You let us work. Why?" "Because you know how to save lives, and because mercy isn't rationed." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "In my country, Mercy is shown only to the obedient. In mine, he said, it's shown to anyone who needs it. That night the nurses were given a tent of their own. Clean blankets, fresh water, even a small lantern that burned steady light into the darkness. They sat together in silence, the weight of the day pressing against their hearts. Emmy whispered, "Aiko, they trusted us." "Yes," Aiko said, staring at her hands, "and I don't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed." She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the camp, men coughing, medics murmuring, the soft click of boots on gravel. Somewhere, an American nurse laughed quietly, and Aiko found herself smiling despite everything. Maybe kindness wasn't victory or defeat. Maybe it was what came after both. At dawn, a cry went up from the surgical tent. A young American had gone into shock from blood loss. Without thinking, Aiko rushed to the sound. The doctors were already there, but short-handed. Hale barked orders, his voice taut. "Clamp, where's the plasma?" Aiko stepped forward. "I can help." For a split second the room froze. Then Hale tossed her a pair of gloves. "You're up, Lieutenant?" When it was over, Hale stood watching them. These women who'd once been terrified prisoners, now saving the camp as if it were their own. He shook his head in disbelief. "I should have known better," he muttered. "Mercy makes the best soldiers." The storm left behind a quiet so pure it felt holy. The next morning the camp woke to clear skies and the smell of wet earth. Hale found Aiko repairing a tent seam with borrowed thread. "You worked half the night," he said. "So did you." He smiled. "Fair enough?" He paused, then added, "When this is over, you'll go home. What will you do then?" Aiko stared at the horizon. "I don't know if home still exists, but maybe I can make one, a place that heals." Harley nodded. "Then we've been on the same mission all along." In the evenings, when the sea breeze cooled the air, Aiko often walked near the shoreline with Grace. They spoke of everything: books, families, the smell of coffee in the morning. Sometimes Grace would ask about Japan, about the mountains and the spring festivals. Aiko described lanterns floating on rivers, cherry blossoms falling like snow. "You'll see them again," Grace said. "Maybe," Aiko replied, "if the world learns not to burn them." As weeks turned to months, the camp became a small model of peace. American medics and Japanese nurses exchanged lessons, recipes, even songs. When an old phonograph played, someone would inevitably say, "Let the nurses choose." Their choice was always the same, a slow melody called Haru no Yume, Dream of Spring. Even the guards stopped saluting them formally. They would simply nod, a gesture that meant, "We see you. You belong here." One morning, Ale gathered the staff for an announcement. Orders came down. The nurses are to be transferred to Tokyo for repatriation. Silence. No one moved. Iko lowered her eyes. The word repatriation sounded final, like the closing of a heart. Beat. Grace stepped forward. "When?" "Tomorrow." Aiko swallowed hard. "Captain Hale, may we finish our rounds before we go?" He nodded. "Finish them. The patients will miss you." That night the camp was restless. Rain tapped gently against the tent roofs. Aiko sat at her small desk, writing her final entry. "Tomorrow we leave. I am afraid of home, but I am more afraid of forgetting these people. They showed us that mercy is stronger than victory. I will carry that truth like a lantern." She folded the page, placed it inside her satchel, and blew out the lantern. The flame died softly, leaving the smell of smoke and peace. The morning of departure came cloaked in mist. The camp seemed quieter than usual, as if it too understood what was being lost. Trucks waited by the main gate, engines humming, ready to take the Japanese nurses to the port where ships would carry them home. Lieutenant Aiko Tanaka stood beside her small duffel bag, eyes fixed on the ground. She had tied her hair back neatly, just as she had on the day she was captured. But this time her hands did not tremble. Grace Henderson approached, holding a folded bundle wrapped in cloth. "Before you go," she said softly, "from all of us." Aiko unfolded it slowly. Inside was a neatly pressed American field nurse's cap, white with a small red cross stitched at the center. Her breath caught. "I cannot—" "You already earned it," Grace interrupted. "You wore the heart before the uniform." Aiko bowed deeply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Grace, for showing me mercy is not weakness." Grace smiled, blinking away tears. "No, it's the only strength that lasts." Captain Hale waited near the convoy. When Aiko approached, he extended his hand. She hesitated for just a second, then shook it firmly. "You taught us something," he said, "that even when the war ends, the healing has to keep going." "And you taught us that trust can survive even here," she replied. He nodded toward the trucks. "Safe travels, Lieutenant Tanaka. When Japan rebuilds, she'll need hands like yours." Aiko met his gaze. "If peace is ever fragile again, promise me you'll protect it." Hale's expression softened. "That's the only mission left." As the trucks began to roll, the nurses waved from the open backs. The Americans stood in formation, not as guards, but as witnesses. When the convoy reached the edge of the camp, a sudden gust lifted the Red Cross banner high, its fabric catching sunlight like a white flame. Aiko turned to look one last time. The Sarsikat MP blurred through the rising dust, the figures of Americans fading into the horizon. She placed her hand over the nurse's cap in her lap and whispered, "We will not forget." Weeks later, Tokyo was a different world, half rubble, half rebirth. The city's streets smelled of dust and sea wind, its people walking with the quiet urgency of survival. The returning nurses were greeted not as heroes, but as ghosts, reminders of a war most wanted to forget. But Aiko refused to disappear. She took a small job at a relief clinic, patching up civilians still bearing the invisible wounds of the war. When people asked where she learned to organize a ward so efficiently, she smiled and said only, "From a camp where enemies became healers." Within a year, the clinic grew into a hospital. She trained other women, young, determined, unbroken, and taught them lessons she had learned in the unlikeliest classroom of all. "Medicine is not about sides," she would say. "It's about beginnings." In 1947, a letter arrived, postmarked United States. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature was not. "Dear Lieutenant Tanaka, this is Captain Hale. I've left the Army and returned home to Oregon. Grace and I are starting a civilian hospital for veterans and their families." We hung a small plaque in the entrance that reads, "To those who healed beyond borders. I thought you should know that your story still travels with us. Yours in peace, Robert Hale." Aiko folded the letter and held it close to her chest. For the first time since returning home, she cried, not from grief, but from something gentler. Gratitude. By 1950, Japan's hospitals began receiving support from international humanitarian groups. Aiko was invited to speak at a medical conference in Osaka, the first time she stood before foreign doctors since the war. The topic: healing after conflict. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed slightly. Rows of faces, Japanese, American, British, looked up at her. She spoke slowly, her voice calm and precise. "I was once a prisoner of war," she began, "but my captors did not punish me. They gave me back my purpose. I learned that healing is not just a profession. It is peace made visible." The hall fell silent. When she finished, applause rose. Not loud, but steady, like a heartbeat. That night, in her hotel room, Aiko placed Hale's letter beside her journal. The pages had grown yellow with time, but the ink still carried the weight of those months in Okinawa. She wrote one more entry. August 1945. The war ended. August 1945. The healing began. If mercy can live in a camp, it can live anywhere. Years later, in 1965, Aiko received another letter, this one from Grace Henderson. My dear Aiko, Robert passed away this spring. Before he did, he asked that his ashes be buried near the old field hospital site in Okinawa. I visited last month. The sea still smells the same, and the wind still carries that strange peace we all felt back then. Your name is carved beside his on the memorial stone, under the words, "They chose to heal." I hope that brings you comfort. It brings me more than I can say. Grace. Aiko read the letter twice, then walked to the hospital courtyard where the sakura trees were blooming. She stood beneath the petals drifting down like snow and whispered, "He kept his promise." In her final years, Aiko became known as the nurse who taught peace. Her students spoke of her calm presence, her quiet insistence that kindness was the highest form of discipline. When asked where she learned that, she would simply smile and point to the small red cross stitched inside her cap. "It was a gift," she'd say, "from those who once called me enemy." Spring 1980. In a small museum near Okinawa, a new exhibit opened titled Mercy in Uniform, The Untold Stories of Battlefield Healers. Among the displays was a white nurse's cap, a faded journal, and a letter with the words, "Because you know how to save lives, and because mercy isn't rationed." Visitors lingered longest at that case. Some read, some cried, some simply stood in silence, awed by how compassion had crossed an impossible border. A schoolgirl pointed to the cap and asked her teacher, "Was she real?" The teacher smiled. Yes, she was the kind of real the world always needs more of. That evening, the sun dipped low over the island, the waves glowing like molten glass. The wind passed through the palm trees, carrying with it a faint echo, laughter, footsteps, voices blending between languages. Somewhere beyond time, the field hospital still stood, its canvas glowing white in eternal light. And in that imagined stillness, Aiko's voice lingered, whispering the lesson that had outlasted every war. Mercy does not end when peace begins. It creates it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more daily WWII stories that uncover the humanity, courage, and forgiveness that outlived the war. Stories that remind us, even when the world breaks, compassion builds it back again.